So I'm Tanya Lee Gregg, principal at Āina Archaeology. Let's see. So my ohana, they're from Makena area. My family we still have our kuleana property along the coastline. So if you're at Makena Landing and you're looking across the bay, the very first house that you see across that bay, that's our hale, that's our land. So very connected to this area. Remember coming here with my grandmother when it was just kiawe trees and centipedes. And cockroaches, big bomber cockroaches. So a lot has shifted. My background in archaeology, I went away to school. I was in Colorado for quite some time, and I got my degree at Western State College, and then my master's degree at Colorado State University. And what brought me home was Koho'olawe. I had an opportunity to work on the clearance project on Koho'olawe. So I spent, 6 years of my early baby archaeology life on Koho'olawe. I was hapai with my first keiki on Koho'olawe, so I feel like even and so that was all fun and good times. I wasn't out there very long, much after that, but I still managed to be involved with Koho'olawe. And so some of the findings that we have here in Honuaʻula and in the Ka'eo project, some of that relates to Koho'olawe, in that some of the stone material. If you went to Koho'olawe, you're familiar with the quarry, Pu'umoiwi. So some of the stone material that we found also links back or is consistent with the same material at Pu'umoiwi, which is what most people think that that area was high trade and back and forth across the channel. So that was super fun to be able to make that, to have participated and mapped out Pu'umoiwi and worked at Pu'umoiwi and then finding Pu'umoiwi material in the archaeology here. So that was pretty cool. Worked for cultural surveys for a very, very long time and then started at Āina archaeology 5-6 years ago. Gosh, it's been a while. Seeking to integrate more of a Hawaiian mindset to archaeological approaches, right? Looking at it, looking at our landscapes from the perspective of our kupuna, and also with a deeper understanding of how our people lived and were resilient on this landscape that doesn't look like much, but landscapers, golf guys, one rain, boof, it all just comes right back, right? So what we see in the summertime is not necessarily indicative what the productivity and the bounty that this place could offer. Wakahiko in the ancient past, even in today. So I wasn't sure of everyone's background and level of knowledge. So we're starting at the beginning for Honuaʻula and applying that to what you're seeing on the ground. And I'm saying that because it's not just, newcomers or recent residents. I've done trainings with longtime hunters on Lanai who have been in these places. I did a training right now, Pulama Lanai, they have a lot of the folks that we trained participate in their culture and history branch, and they're the stewards of the archaeology out on Lanai. And so early, we thought, hey, the residents should be the ones to do archaeology here, right? So we started this training program, and they came out with us during a survey when there was a thought that there was going to be a huge wind farm in the northern part of the island. And mind you, these are hunters, born and raised on Lanai, and looking at the landscape through an archaeological lens rather than a hunting lens kind of had things pop out for them. And they themselves had said, I don't look at the landscape the same. I notice things differently and I notice more things, right? So like when I don't know, CJ's probably gonna be like, that's not how it goes, Tanya. But when you're out hunting and you're looking for a hunting blind, sometimes the most convenient hunting blind is an archaeological site. Sometimes in those archaeological sites and you're sitting back there, you're trying to get out from the wind and the rain, you open up a can of Vienna sausage and you accidentally leave it behind, right? So when these hunters came out, they're like, oh wow, look at all this rubbish on these archaeological sites. I see it now. Oh, look at all these bullet shells. I see it now. Going out onto along the shoreline, salt pans, look at all this fishing line. I see it now, right? So it's not necessarily like, I want you to like know this stuff because this is your kuleana. I want you to think about it in terms of, oh my God, I see it now. And now I'm gonna care for it. I really, really like this olelo no eao. So this olelo no eao, Honuaʻula kua laʻolao. It refers to the callous-backed people of Honuaʻula, this whole region. And what that means, and it sounds kind of like, what? What is that? And it refers to the heat of the sun, right? The heat on the sun on the backs of the people who are working super, super hard and being super, super productive in this space and in this place, right? It speaks to the resiliency of the people of this area, right? So the callous-backed people of Honuaʻula is that reference to the resiliency of the people of Honuaʻula, whether it's in making the land or coaxing the lands to be productive, whether it's in the heat of change, culture change, land use changes, just resiliency overall. And knowing that, the families of Honuaʻula remain. So that's why I like this one. So I just kind of want to start. Are you familiar with the Moku system? Or Moku land divisions or Hawaiian land tenure? So in traditional Hawaiian land tenure, especially here on Maui, across the Pai Āina, but I'm going to focus on Maui, the lands of Maui are divided into 12 districts. We call them Moku today. And they go from Wailuku or Nawaiʻeha, which is from Waiheʻe to Waikapu, right? So that's an example of a West Maui. Here, for Honuaʻula, the name of the Moku is Honuaʻula, right? So sometimes you may hear like the Ahupuaʻa of Honuaʻula. That's a misnomer. Honuaʻula is the entire district in the traditional land tenure system and extends from Kahoʻolave across the channel to the shores of this area, up Mauka, across the crater to a point or a specific pohaku in Haleakala. So that's where we're anchored. That is the piko of East Maui, and that's the anchor for Honuaʻula at Ulupalakoa. Within Honuaʻula, we have several Ahupuaʻa. So think of it like district. Sometimes it's hard to do these comparatives, but district and maybe county. Yeah. Ahupuaʻa, so there are several, and they go from Paiʻahu, which is, Kilohana Drive? So that's the boundary between Kulamoku and Honuaʻula at Paiʻahu, and it goes all the way to Kanaio. So the boundary for Honuaʻula starts at Kilohana Drive, interestingly enough, and it goes to the boundary with Kahiki Nui, which is at Auahi. So the wind farms are a good boundary to look at when you're looking at it laterally like that. So the lands of Discovery Land extends from Keauho, Ahupuaʻa. So if you think of Wailea, it's Paiahu, Palauea, and a portion of Keauho. So Discovery Land begins at Discovery Lands covers the Ahupuaʻa from Keauho all the way to Aki. So Mo'oiki and on over. So Mo'oiki, if you think in terms of Pu'uola'i or Big Beach, the lands of Discovery Land. So you're crossing, so the Discovery Land's boundary crosses like 10 Ahupuaʻa, right? So one thing that we're consistently kind of trying to have people come around to is understanding space in terms of Ahupuaʻa, right? There are reasons why certain land divisions exist the way they are. Mo'iki, Mo'oloa, Mo'omoku, all the mo'os, call them all the mo'os. Those are kind of in line with the lava flow, right? So thinking about that in those terms, like what is important? Why did Hawaiians divide their lands in this way, right? And what are good uses of the lands in this way? Just thinking about it in terms of that. So here, from Keauho, Onau to Onau. You have a small portion in Onau. And so what that means too is that you have a variety of landscapes, not just the lava flows versus the open fields versus the grasslands. You're also looking at varieties in archaeology as well. And that speaks to the landscape and how our kupuna thought about that landscape, settled that landscape, and maybe some of the limitations and some of the advantages of doing things in a certain way on that landscape. Okay. So Honuaʻula was a land of agriculture, right? From Papaʻanui to here and beyond. There is a system referred to, first coined by the Bishop Museum, called the McKenna Field System. And it speaks to the ingenuity of our kupuna in use of the natural contours of the Aina, right? And so in the McKenna Field System, you have your living spaces toward the top of the ridge. You're familiar with this, I think, from all the clearing that we've done. And the slopes of the ridges were contoured with agricultural terraces because of great advantages. One, retains the soil really well that way because you're building up retaining terraces and all the soil sort of gathers behind it, both naturally and with the help of our people. It takes advantage of water flow naturally. There's no need for a pump station to pump your water up. It just kind of flows naturally downslope. And we know that from the archaeology and also from the records of the Māhele Āina. So when Kamehameha III divided all the lands amongst the people, there was a part of that act that allowed for the native tenant to come forward and make claims, right? And these claims for land would be based on what they were used for, right? So if you were awarded your claim, you were able to show that you've been living on the land prior to Kamehameha I, or it was gifted to you by Ali'i during the time of Kamehameha I. But that testimony had to say what you were doing on that land. So a lot of the testimony helps us to kind of link the voices of our kupuna and what they're talking about. This is cut off. It says mahi'ai. 6 mala, right? So mahi ai, or mala, ea ke ia vau mala, so my mala, I have 6. Mala is a term for an agricultural space, like a garden, right? So we know at Papaʻanui, in a place called Keawakapu. So where do you think, do you know about Keawakapu? Where do you think Keawakapu is? Yeah. Oftentimes, in Hawaiian place names, we have a reuse of place names. So here in Honuaʻula, we also have a Keawakapu. And it's where the church is also Keawakapu, right? So this confused me. I'm like, when I first read it, I was like, oh, this kupuna, is he really in Papaʻanui or not? But he's talking specific, so this also gives us some indication of where in Papaʻanui, what specific place in Papaʻanui this kupuna was farming. Because he's telling us, I have 6 mala at Keawakapu. Yeah. And it brings such a joy to so many people, like so many kanaka, when you use the proper place names, right? So I say Big Beach because I know that that's a common reference, and I'm trying to get away from saying Big Beach, but it's Oneloa, right? Black Sand Beach, I'm trying to get away from that. It's Onoli. Some people say Oneuli, but I asked my uncle, oh, is that Oneuli? And he said, where the heck is that? It's Onoli. So there's some nuances there as well, right? So, you know, so there just brings such great joy to sort of bring back these place names and use them in everyday language, right? But places have a vibe, and it resonates. And when you start calling the place by its actual name, and not its nickname or its name that it never asked to be called, it starts to resonate, right? Yeah. And even in sales, right? Like sales or membership or however you want to, wherever you're interacting with folks who may be new to this place. Hey, there's some folks who have lived here all their lives and they never even know. Like they did not know that, you know, where I lived by the David Malo Church in Kalepolepo was named Kalepolepo. They didn't know that. And it's wild because it's within a singular generation that information went away, right? So that's how quickly things get lost. And it's so hard to bring them back to common usage, right? So membership, for example, so I got off track there. Membership or something like that. Like, you know where these places are and introduce these places to your membership or to your owners as through their proper names, right? Ka'eo, oh my gosh, I get so much heat from Uncle Eddie Chang about this. Part of Ka'eo North, or most of Ka'eo North, is actually in Papaʻanui Ahupuaʻa, right? So and I get like the need for like project names because you have to distinguish your areas. But man, do I catch gas from Uncle Eddie Boy when I talk about the Ka'eo project, but it's actually in Papaʻanui, right? So even then, like with your membership, like it's called Ka'eo for the project or for this lovely space. But actually, we're in Papaʻanui. So maybe big papa'a, big super burnt, yeah, like charred, like on a grill, charred, or like you never put sunscreen and use in the sun all day, charged. No. So there's a couple of thoughts behind that. And CJ, you can like chime in here. if you're like, Tanya, you're making that up. It's just sort of like there's another place called Pulehu Nui, right? And Pulehu means to grill, right? And it's these spaces that are just ridiculously sun-baked, right? And you wouldn't think of these spaces as being particularly green, right? Or lush and flourishing. So papa'a nui, papa'a being burnt, papa'a being the heavy stuff. Going back to that olelo no eao about Honuaʻula, la'ola'o, the callous back people with the sun bearing down on their backs, the people of this area, just the heat of the space. Yeah, and if you've ever been outside over there in August for 10 hours, yeah, that's pretty. It's dry, it's heat, it's burnt. If you don't put sunscreen, you're gonna get papa'a. Yeah. So we move from the land to the ocean, right? And you may have heard folks just kind of refer to this side of the community of Maui as being longtime fishermen. The families in this area, longtime fishermen. Ka'oihana lawai'a being fishing, right? The work of fishermen. So not only did we have open fishing where it's nets and line, but we also had at least, well, Ahupuaʻa being a fish pond, so aquaculture, fish husbandry, right? Making sure that, and a lot of, for like fish ponds, you think about fish ponds, and it's really to make sure that there's a sustainable and reliable source of food, right? So sustainable and reliable source of food on the land, and sustainable, reliable source of food in the water, right? And so that interconnection here extended all the way to Keoneo'io, which is, or Ahikina'o, Kanahena area. And there are massive fish ponds out there as well. The well-known Jeff Bezos has a beautiful fish pond on his property. And on the a'a, where you don't expect there to be anything, right? You go onto a lava field, what is gonna be? It's like hot, it tears up your shoes in like 3 days when you're hiking. What is out there? Choke stuff out there. There are ancholine ponds for various reasons, kind of like the refrigerator for Callous would say, that's where, girl, you don't know what that is? I'm all like, well, tell me anything. That is where the fishermen will go fishing and throw their fish into the ancholine ponds to preserve them, right? Or to keep them fresh, like the refrigerator. You have the open ocean refrigerator and you have the ancholine pond refrigerator, right? And these ancholine ponds are so cool because they're all kind of segmented within each other. There's segments in the ancholine ponds themselves. The way that our kupuna utilize these landscapes that to the most modern eyes seems a little bit like, what are you doing on the a'a? Like, what is out there, right? You have fresh water on the a'a. You have pukas or holes or wells out in the a'a where the water comes bubbling up out in that area. You have these amazing ancholine ponds, which are brackish. Speaks to the water availability from below. And then you have these kipuka in the lava, where the lava went around, and some of the most intensively productive soil is in these kipuka. And then you find agriculture, all developed in these kipuka, right? So knowing the landscape, Papa'a Nui, we have beautiful complexes that have agricultural terraces coming down the ridge lines, soil everywhere, but even in the a'a flows, the people of Honuaʻula were just resilient and made the most of it, right? So when you're talking to your membership, let me tell you how cool the kupuna of this place used to be. Could you live in the a'a? They did, right? And these resources are amazing. So just watch the different winds and how that goes, you know, and it'll come to you. This photo, I always throw this photo in because this is my great-grandfather. Yeah. So this is out in Kanahena. He lived in Kanahena. So this is them on that road in this old truck. And his hand is like this. Do you know the story behind the shaka?
You should tell us.
Should I tell you? So along with our amazing fishing traditions from Akule surrounds, which were communal fishing, where you would take a big net and throw a net over, line the bay with the net and slowly bring it in to bring the big stocks of akule in that then would be shared with ulupalako and even people from Wailuku. Had that traditional communal fishing method. You had kapapai, where you slap the water to make the fish go in the net, fish traps. And then you had a new fishing tradition called fishing by dynamite. And that's to say, I will caveat that with recognition of effective ways to accomplish your task. One of them was dynamite. So my great-grandfather, he held the dynamite stick too long and it blew up in his hand. And so he lost these 3 fingers. So that, and it wasn't just my grandfather, it was, I think, a thing that nobody wanted to blow their hand up, but it was something that you notice amongst fishermen who maybe held onto the dynamite too long, so they lose this. So you know, you're walking, what's up? So that's a urban legend, but in reality, that's how he got his shaka. Regardless, he could build a house with that shaka. He could fix a net with that shaka. So that's him. And that's the story of at least his shaka. In recognizing the breadth of Honuaʻula extending into Kahoʻolawe, right? And recognizing that these waters belong to Honuaʻula, but more specifically, the waters between here and Molokini and the Fishery of Molokini were the rights of the native tenants of Papa Anui, right? So it's not just a system where you're stopping at the ocean and your native tenant rights halt at the ocean. Your native tenant rights extend into the ocean, not just for fishing, not just because of fishing, I should say that, but because it is your native tenant right. So you'll hear sometimes other folks say, you stay in your Ahupuaʻa, I'll stay in my Ahupuaʻa, these are my fishing rights in my Ahupuaʻa. So knowing that it's not just a free-for-all. It never was a free-for-all. But it was a very systematic way of ensuring management in a traditional way, right? So the rights of the native tenant. The rights of the native tenant for Papa Anui extended into Molokini. And certain special rights were extended to the konohiki, or the sheriff of Papa Anui. You always had these land managers. So kind of like y'all are the konohiki of this space, right? Managing and caring for the tenants. That was the job of the konohiki. Okay. And then in Honuaʻula, a strong sense of ceremony and religion, right? Of understanding that certain areas, certain places, certain viewscapes, certain view planes are to be revered for various reasons, be it to ensure that we have good rains, to ensure that we have a wealth of ocean resources, to observe alignments above. And so Honuaʻula has several structures that are dedicated to ceremony and religion, right? This is Pohaku Nahaha Heiau. So this is over by Haleo Makena. Okay. I don't know what that heiau was for, or what that space was most important for. What strikes me as interesting about that particular heiau is that it's in a low, because in a lot of spaces the heiau are elevated above to have that view plane. So I find that interesting, right? And then, so all the way from over there, we go all the way to Mo'oiki, and there are many heiau in between. This is, we've been calling it Mo'oiki Heiau. And this is a very unique structure. Its view plane is to the left of Pu'ola'i. And I've always wanted to, since learning about it, I've wanted to understand what that particular heiau was looking at. Is it looking at a spot on Koho'olawe? So, you know, CJ, those trees, we just bring those down just a little. So, you know, so our modern landscape sometimes gets in the way of understanding the true view plane and needs for that area. Ceremony and religion, the height of a very important part of everyday life in Wakahiko or in ancient times, and that transferred into the Western era in the form of a different religion. Heiau and Ko'a. So Ko'a are shrines. So you have a Ko'a on Honoiki Road, corner Honoiki Road and Old McKenna Road. That corner there's a Ko'a there, right? So what is a Ko'a? It's a shrine. When you find them along the shoreline, they're more often dedicated to Ku'ula, who became a god for fishermen and ensured strong or a good catch. But you would always have to give back part of your catch, right? Funny story, I did not know. I just relatively recently learned that the color for Ku'ula is red, right? Because we have these deities that have different associations with them, right? And I'll defer to Le'ahi for the majority, but I just relatively recently learned that the color for Ku'ula is red. And why that strikes me is because I was always told by my mom, by my grandma, never ever wear red in the ocean. Don't do it. They would never tell me why. Until I was like, I made that connection when I learned that the color for Ku'ula was red, and knowing that our ohana were strongly rooted in a fishing tradition. My grandfather, who was very, very, he was Christian, but also held his Hawaiian traditions close, right? So yeah, that's I just made that connection. Like, that's why I'm not supposed to wear red when going in the water. Because I remember looking at the lifeguards, I'm like, all your shorts are red, how come? Like, how come you get to wear red in the ocean, but I cannot wear red? It clicked. It's a fishing family. We don't wear red in the ocean because it's Ku'ula's color. You can, I've seen folks call Ko'a or refer to Ko'a as Ahu. The key distinction, but an Ahu can also just be a marker, like a marker, right, on the landscape. An Ahu can be, and there's a difference between an Ahu that is a marker and a Ku Ahu that is a place for offering. And a Ko'a that is a place for specific worship of Ku'ula, or there are lono stones up in the Mauka regions. But So they do get interchanged, but for your understanding, like if there is coral is revered as a material that is sacred, and often used in offerings, right? So if you see a structure of stones and it has coral on it, that is kind of a marker of maybe a ceremonial aspect to that rather than a functional aspect, like a marker. The archaeology, going back to archaeology just real briefly, in the early archaeological surveys in the 1980s and early 1990s, there was a pattern of seeing sort of these ahu markers toward the top of these agricultural complexes. And it's sort of like, and it was they were interpreted as these markers of where the habitation or where people were living in and amongst these hundreds of agricultural terraces. So they could also be markers for habitation, but referred to as ahu. So moving right along, there's things happening on Maui, and then a shift, right? The arrival of European vessels in these waters in 1778. That is a catalyst for a major culture shift. And things would change. Honuaʻula would change, right, as a result of that. So we have the introduction of Christianity, and some folks have mixed feelings about it, but I want to point, and I'll get to this in the slideshow, Keawalaʻi becomes a cornerstone, a piko for the people of this time period to gather, right? Keawalaʻi Church becomes important. The Māhele Āina. So I've been making references to the Māhele and Kuleana. The Māhele Āina happens in 1838, and that brings in, what that does is it brings forward a Western style concepts of land tenure, right? It goes from being the lands of the konohiki and caretaking of the maka'ainana, and it being more of a collective, to a fee simple structure, which causes another shift and was influenced and led to the rise of commerce and industry, right? So 1778 happens. There's changes afoot. Kamehameha I he's on the rise. At the same time that we're having these Western influences come about, Kamehameha I is on his campaign to unify the islands. And all of that happens in a culture clash, or a cultural shift, right? Because now we have one ruler of 7 of the 8 islands, right? Kauai will come later. That's a whole nother story. And we have one ruler with his government across the Pai'aina, across the islands. And we have these Western influences coming, right? So we have a shift. So the development of Christianity at Honuaʻula was a community effort, was a communal effort. And so what's interesting is we see that the initial thoughts to build that church starts in 1854, right? So that's quite some time ago. What is interesting is that there is a thought that some of these stones that were used to build the church may have come from across the street. Do you know what's across the street from Keawalaʻi Church? Kalani Heiau. It's a massive heiau, thought to have been a luakini. There's a corner of that heiau prior to all the development and when the archaeology was getting done. There's a corner of that heiau that some of the stones seem to curiously be less than the rest of the heiau. And so there is a thought, and that corner is the corner that's closest to the church. So there is a thought that some of the stones, even with the mo'olelo saying we brought the stones from up Mauka and we traveled it down. We got the coral to create the mortar from the sea. So it was a Mauka to Makai thing. Some of the stones may also be a part of a traditional luakini. Churches would be referred to in Hawaiian languages as luakini as well. So sort of that duality. Luakini is a heiau. Luakini specifically was known for being sacrificial, more high level, right? So not everyone. It wasn't a community sort of halepule or place of worship. It was very stratified, and there were rules about who could participate in ceremony and where the maka'ainana would be at that time, right? So, and usually that's where different laws were made or different couple were initiated at the luakini. And then we have the Māhele Āina. The Māhele Āina happened, or it was initiated in 1838 by Kamehameha III. So there are some thoughts about the Māhele Āina, and not everyone in our community agrees with the outcomes or the reasons for it. But at the time, there was this, just before 1838, there was an incident on Oahu with a ship captain, De Palais. I said that awfully. And he claimed the islands for the British Crown. Took it over. And there was a plea to Queen Victoria at the time. She told him, "What the heck are you doing? Stop that. We're not doing that." So then it was, so then the islands were transferred back, never really being taken in the first place. But what that did is it kind of set off sort of some bells, right? At the time, everything was under the ownership of the monarchy. So if a foreign power were to come and take control of the kingdom, they would have control of all the land, technically. So for me, I fall into the school of thought that it was genius for Kauikeaoli, or Kamehameha III, to begin the process of the Māhele Āina, because then it gave land to the people, to the maka'ainana, to the native tenant, in a system that was recognized on a Western level, right? So you can't necessarily take my land because I own it in fee simple, right? I am the native tenant of the land. I own this. And it wasn't, and our Kanaka, they were savvy. They would hui up, because there was also, and kind of how a lot of the lands here came under one ownership, there was the process for the native tenant to make their claims, because they were on that aina. They knew they could prove that they were on that aina prior to 1778, or that an ali'i gave it to them in Kamehameha's time. And then there was another process where the lands that were split out to be retained for the crown, meaning the monarch, and retained for the government, meaning the Hawaiian government, the Kingdom of Hawaii, the government structure, kind of like County DLNR. The government, those could be partitioned out and sold, right? So the native tenant received their titles because they were on the land. The ali'i received their titles because it was transferred to them by the king. Then you had this whole other plot of land, or pot of land, that was either determined to be government land or crown land. And there was an act passed that allowed government lands to be carved up and sold. So our Kanaka sometimes would hui up to purchase lands from the government together. Our Kanaka people participated in the Māhele Āina, so or these land grant, land purchasing. So you'll see here in the mo'os, sort of these really square plots. Those are land grants. Those are land grants that were owned or bought by Hawaiian citizens. Okay? These big ones, those were transferred to large landowners, and namely Linton Torbert and my third great grandfather, William Wilcox. And that's how, while we had our Native people participate at a small level, we also had large land purchases by foreign purchasers that then facilitated different activities. For Wailuku area, that was Claus Spreckles and the birth of HCNS. For Lahaina area, that was Turton and Pioneer Mill Coal. And for Honuaʻula, it was first Linton Torbert with his potato venture. And then it was the captain for his ventures, and ultimately Ulupakua Ranch for ranching, right? So that's sort of how that all dissipated, and how then these large commercial activities would come to influence how people were living in a specific area, namely here. There's certainly worry, right? And you see that in the newspapers. The Hawaiian language newspapers, specifically, you have letters to the editor that discuss the changing landscape and the increase in famine and the removal of tree cover to facilitate. In Wailuku, you specifically have people lamenting that the kalo lands are being turned over for sugar, and that is going to result in the decline of the Kanaka. So it's not, and I don't want to get into, try not to lecture. So it's not oh, this is a change and we're going to go along with it. Our people were resilient in that they were able to adapt, but it's not, the more and more that you read in the newspaper clippings and the more that you dive into the Hawaiian language newspapers, you begin to realize that there is a sense of loss and a sense of rebellion in one way or another. Yeah. But in all of that, like I said, our people are resilient and adaptive, right? And of course I'm biased because it's like the ability, the quickness at which our Kanaka learned a new religion, a new language, multiple languages. And I know that you hear this a lot, or maybe you don't, but becoming the most literate nation in the world at that time, right? Hundreds of Hawaiian language newspapers printed. As soon as they could write things down and like print things, man, holy cats, were people going for it, right? You had Moby Dick translated into Hawaiian language and printed in the newspapers, right? It was just like a thirst for knowledge and a thirst to be able to thrive, right? And a keen ability to adapt and develop new culture, or put our stamp on an existing thing, right? The paniolo, right? And learning how to maneuver horses in this environment, learning how to maneuver, like, to swim cattle on horseback after driving the cattle down the mountain, getting in the water on your horse, swimming the cattle out to the steamship, and then hooking that cattle up, helping to hook up that cattle, and then swimming your horse back to go get more. I mean, I don't know who's the greatest horse people on the planet, but then I am biased. And that played out in the most historic wins of the rodeo in Wyoming, with Ikua Purdy leading the pack. You know, who are these Hawaiians? What do they know about horsemanship? Well, Have you ever tried to drive cattle into the ocean? Yeah. So being able to adapt and even putting our own stamp on things, right? Different Paniolo culture, different Paniolo crafts, you know? Talking to Brad and how they would go out into wherever they went, but come out of wherever they were with these hakules for themselves and the horses. Like, these are like cowboys doing that, right? It's just amazing. And I always tell folks, and I do mention to folks as well, like, the people who have to live closest to the land today, like ranchers, like cowboys, those are the people that you want to talk to, because they live closest to the land today, like our kupuna used to live close to the land before. And everything that I presented to you here today, right? Everything, like, particularly the traditional stuff, right? The complex agriculture, the evidence of ingenuity, right? The density of what was going on, right? Villages, fishing villages, families, right? And now imagine, and we'll get here, that you had all this activity, and then all of a sudden there's a population decline. People move out of McKenna, right? But all this is here. Now, you know, we're relearning about these spaces. We can read about it, and that's great. But to see it on the landscape in its truest form, that is pretty powerful. Now imagine a D9 coming through that whole area I described. The ankling pond. Now, this is extreme because the ankling ponds aren't going anywhere. But like a D9 coming through that entire place and scraping all of it off of the landscape. And if that system wasn't recorded in a specific way, the ingenuity and that information and the realization of that ingenuity is gone forever, right? And we don't have that to share, because now it's a landscape that had been remolded from its natural state. So we can't even imagine from a natural standpoint how that could have looked, because the ridgelines are gone, because things are filled in that may have been gullies and may have had terraces, right? So if we don't know this stuff, then we can't speak to the resiliency of our history. So when you hear people say they're erasing us, that's that reference, because it is quite literal. Yeah. If we don't preserve, and that's not to say that we have to preserve everything, right? I mean, that's harsh and that's inconceivable. Population changes, time changes things, people move in and out, different things happen. You can't save everything, because then there will be nowhere for the living to grow. But how do we honor that came before, right? Instead of wiping it clear off and only having like little tiny snippets. So my example is South Ka'eo. I love this example. We had a dot on the map, 4 dots on the map, and maybe a small terrace or something like that. Went back out, that dot blew up into hundreds of terraces. Now, had we moved forward with just knowing what that one dot was in the original plan, all of that would have been a victim to the D9. And we wouldn't know. And there's knowledge in knowing, especially when you're living in a space where the landscape and nature and the elements sort of dictate what's going on. How are we going to know if we only think there's just this one thing? Nobody was here. There's just this one terrace. Turns out there were hundreds. And it takes a while to document hundreds.